Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is supported by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Telecommunications Access Minnesota, and Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Across from City Hall in Nisswa and online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Lakeland Currents, and thanks for sticking with us tonight. We're coming an hour later than our normal usual time. It's a pledge week, so bear with us, and there's a pretty good concert coming up after us, so stay with us. Our topic tonight is water, lakes, and rivers. And I guess there's probably not a more timely circumstance to talk about this than right now with the crisis that we're having in the Gulf. And if there was ever a time to appreciate what we have in Minnesota, it's probably now. And before we introduce our guests, I would like to just talk a little bit about some of the water features in Minnesota that make us one of the most unique states in the United States. We have 11,842 lakes of over 10 acres, which is a huge number of lakes of fresh water. We have 6,564 natural rivers and streams that together flow for 69,000 miles. That's 69,000 miles just in the state of Minnesota. The Mississippi River, our largest river, winds 680 miles from its beginning down to the Iowa border. And Minnesota has approximately 10 million acres of wetlands. And one time we had a lot more than that, of course, but we've lost a lot of that. So tonight we're going to be talking about healthy lakes and rivers and a partnership that's helping preserve these. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce my guest this evening. And he is Don Hickman. And I'll make sure you get your title here right, Don. Don is a Senior Program Manager for Planning and Preservation with the Initiative Foundation. And you are also a scientist, I might add, because you are a biologist. And thank you for being on our show. I appreciate your taking the time to do this and talk about this very important subject. Before we get into what your partnership is all about, maybe we could just talk a little bit about some general things about water. But before you do that, I'd like to just ask you about, I know you just came back from Vietnam.
It's true.
And a lot of us, I think, are curious about what is happening environmentally in Vietnam since America basically has left that area.
Well, you have to remember we left a long time ago. I was over there for a week of beautiful pleasure and tourism, and then a very humbling week of service work. And just like my visit 10 years ago when we went there to adopt my daughter, I was struck by the relative lack of biodiversity. And I know that that's not particularly natural in a beautiful coastal area like that. And those I've talked to have suggested it's probably a result of the damage that occurred during the war.
Agent Orange and some of the other things that happened there.
The defoliants, yep.
Right.
And it was a beautiful, beautiful trip. The week of pleasure travel, of leisure travel, you could almost advertise as ecotourism. We were at 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But you'll also see, as you will in any community with a lot of poverty, that environmental concerns aren't their top urgency. Putting food on the table today and educating the youth tomorrow is more important than the legacy we leave our children in terms of environmental stewardship.
Interesting. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the Initiative Foundation.
Sure.
What it does, how big of an area it serves.
Very good. The Initiative Foundation is one of 6 autonomous sister foundations created in 1986. The McKnight Foundation, which was 3M money, is based in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and was widely recognized as a philanthropic leader, but criticized for not having as big an impact in greater Minnesota. And so their solution was to help create these 6 sisters. And again, hard economic times, it was the farm crisis. Our founding principle, and really the guiding one to this day, was trying to help create good jobs for rural people so they can stay and be stewards of healthy communities in greater Minnesota. It's probably that legacy that let an old aquatic ecologist sneak on staff about 12 years ago. Our board recognized that folks will move or stay in central Minnesota because of access to beautiful surface waters, to the forests and prairies of our region. And once they let me in, they're having a hard time getting rid of me.
Wow, and how long have you been with the initiative?
I've actually been on staff a little over 10 years. No, a little under 10 years, but I consulted. We started the program 11 and a half years ago.
What are some of the basic ways that you raise money for your foundation?
Well, any way we can. We have an endowment, but when you realize that we serve 14 counties and 162 cities, the endowment doesn't go very far. It allows us to grant about $1 million annually, but that gets spent very, very quickly, and actually 90% of that is dedicated. It's not free to spend on anything we'd want. When I raise money for the Healthy Lakes and Rivers Partnership, and we'll give away around $100,000 a year, that's out of that $1 million. And there's other great programs. You featured our Inside Out Connections 2 weeks ago. We only have about $150,000 a year that we can give to whatever the most urgent needs in a community are. A lot of foundations, a few individuals, and we're hoping to grow the individual givers.
And I know for foundations, this last 2-year period has been really tough just because of the economy. So
it has.
It's impacted your budgets, I'm sure.
Well, and without being over the top, it's been even harder because we also have unique dispensation from the Internal Revenue Service to lend as a charitable activity. We will help entrepreneurs that are committed to living wage jobs, and a lot of them have done even worse than our endowment did. And so it's been leaner times. On the other hand, you know you're making a difference. And so I've never felt more appreciated either.
I know that you, and we'll get to your partnership in a moment here, but I know that you spend a fair amount of your time on prevention, trying to educate people. And I think this crisis in the Gulf is really a good example. If we had spent more time probably in the prevention side of this, it probably will never be straightened out in our lifetime, the damage that's being done in the Gulf. And I think maybe the things that are happening to water in Minnesota are more subtle, but also serious. And I know that part of what you're going to talk about is water and lake, what we can see as we're driving around. But Minnesota has a huge aquifer system, a lot of underwater water, or water in aquifers that are down all 200 feet or more. And there's a concern in many areas that a lot of that water is not safe too. And it's interesting, we had the Pollution Control Agency folks on here a while back. There's a lot of our rivers and lakes that haven't ever even been sampled. We don't actually know the makeup of some of these waters. So I think it's so important to have the program that you do and programs like that are helping volunteers come in and do some of that work too. But arsenic is a concern in Minnesota waters, isn't it?
It's naturally occurring element in most places. It's naturally occurring, and it has been associated with liver cancer and other pretty serious diseases. So yeah, it is something one should test if one drinks groundwater. And
we don't really know that much about, excuse me, how much arsenic is creating a problem, do we? I mean, I think there are safe levels that have been determined, but there is one community that I have just discovered, I'm not going to mention it on air here, but they're finding very high levels of arsenic. It's concerning people greatly, and it is around a lakes area. And they're trying to figure out how can they make it safe to drink that water when it's coming out of wells. And so many of our viewers live in rural Minnesota, and you wonder sometimes how many of them have had their wells tested. Some of them are very close to septic systems. This is a concern too, is it not? Well, it is, and as you referred to, anybody that lives in a rural area is drinking groundwater. If you're on your own well, nobody else is testing that. That's your responsibility. And besides worrying about sewage, arsenic and radon would probably be the two other parameters I would most quickly test on my own well and have. And I know it's recommended by many people that you have your water chlorinated probably once a year. And I've talked to people who have lived in farmsteads for 25 years, never had it tested. They have no clue what they're drinking. How would one go about getting in touch with someone that could help you chlorinate water? There are a lot of certified laboratories throughout the state, right here in town, really everywhere. And if you called the Pollution Control Agency, they can give you a roster of the folks who've gone through the certification, and any one of them would be happy to advise you. So one piece of advice we'd have for viewers tonight is to test your water. Sure. It's well worth it, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. If you're on your own well. If you're on your own well. Let's talk a little bit about your partnership, the Healthy Lakes and Rivers Partnership. What is it? Super. I like to joke that it's the serenity prayer
of lake management. As citizens, we tend to think that our lakes are protected and managed by the state agencies. We've got a strong DNR and a well-known pollution control agency. But the truth is that, at least in modern times, most of the decisions we make that affect our lakes or rivers are made locally on issues that generally the state agencies don't have much influence and probably don't want to come into conflict with local governments anyway. Issues like septic management, or how you landscape your lake, even whether you manage aquatic vegetation. And so those are regulated activities to a degree, but they're probably most effectively managed by citizen stewards. And so we try to build the capacity of volunteer leaders to strategically plan to preserve or restore their lakes.
And you serve, did you say 14 counties with the initiative?
Correct.
Fund? Are there other groups similar to yours in other parts of the state, so that if someone wanted to be involved or participate, they could contact someone?
Our program's pretty unique. However, in the last several years, I guess the first time was 2004, our sister foundation in Bemidji first asked us to come help them get going, and they've now participated in the program 3 times with Hubbard, Beltrami, and Clearwater counties. And then just this past month, we've been over with our sister in Fergus Falls, working with Becker, Douglas, and Ottertail counties. And I'm out fundraising right now in hopes that we can work in the southern part of the state, perhaps as early as next year.
So what do you do? Do you go into a river or a lake and do you try to analyze what's going on that particular body of water?
We actually first contact the local soil and water conservation district and ask them to help us select up to 8 groups, 8 lake associations or river groups in the same county or watershed. And in a way, this was an accidental discovery, but it's one of the reasons this program works better than anything. We chose 8 groups because that's about how many people you can speak to and afford to feed at a training session. But what we've also learned in the subsequent near 12 years is that long after the grant money is spent, they'll become one another's best source of wisdom. Today, you may be worried about aquatic invasive species, and I'm worried about septic systems, but the odds are once you've figured out what to do with yours, I want to come learn what you did because that's on my horizon too. And the other virtue is if you call the county commissioner all in a tither about environmental issues, he'll probably think you're a wacko. But if a bunch of us do, they realize it's a mainstream issue. And so it really helps to have a broad and representative constituency working in common. I guess the final virtue of that collective strategy is so many of the services you may wish to purchase are way cheaper in bulk, whether it's water quality testing or septic inspection or any of a dozen other professional services. We can get them at a fraction of the cost if everybody needs the same thing.
2 things that I've learned anecdotally this summer about invasive species. We're talking a little bit about that. First one is that there are parts of Mille Lacs where the zebra mussels are so thick that it's not safe to walk into the water without shoes on.
Yeah.
And there's, if there's a beer can or a pop can or something that's been thrown out of a boat, they collect to that, and people who are fishing are starting to catch these things because they're so rough around the edges.
That's right.
And they're in Mille Lacs Lake, and they're in a number of other lakes, and there's really nothing we know of to get rid of those.
Not the zebra mussels.
Do we know what they're doing to the lakes long term?
Ironically, they improve water clarity. They're very hard on vegetation, so you will have an improvement of water clarity, but in the end, that relative reduction of vegetation is not good for the fisheries, and it's certainly hard on boats or any physical structure in the lake as well. One of the other lessons we try and impart to our lake associations is whatever you manage, whatever you're trying to achieve, has consequences on a lot of other things too. With the invasive exotics, certainly there are pesticides one can use to manage aquatic invasives, but if you're too successful, you may end up really impairing the fishery as well, or taking down enough plants that were assimilating nutrients that you ultimately have a decline in water quality. So boy, it's a delicate act, like all of ecology. Everything's related, and you need to be pretty careful about upsetting the balance.
One of the things that I've seen myself is on Leech Lake, Bear Island is, I think it is recognized as our largest island in Minnesota on a lake. The east side of Bear Island, where I have spent a lot of my time, is almost devoid of plant life. And one theory is that the invasive rusty crayfish are destroying that particular weed. Now, Leech Lake also has Eurasian water milfoil, but they feed on that too. So these rusty crayfish, we don't know a lot about them, do we?
No, we really don't.
But that's obviously going to harm the fishery if we have a lot of that plant life destroyed.
Yeah, it's certainly the worry. At Leech, you have the virtue of being one heck of a large lake. One of the standard bad jokes I use with all my groups is we'd all like to be rich and good looking. The bad news is you've got to work with what the good Lord gave you. If you're large, and especially if you're deep, your lake, you're a lot more immune to a lot of the things we tend to worry about. Doesn't mean you can forget about them, but nature will be a lot more forgiving. If you're shallower or a smaller drainage, I live on Lougy Lake, not far from here, about 200 acres, no inlets and no outlets. The good news is that means our future's within our own control, but the bad news is if we screw it up, it'll be right in our face.
You know, it's just, I know one of the real big concerns is the VHS, or this virus that can be transmitted. It is not yet known to be in Minnesota, but it's driving up the cost of bait dealers doing business because they have to be certified, they have to have their bait inspected now. It's not uncommon to find a dozen red-tailed chubs for $10 or even 11, I've heard in places. So it's driving the cost up, and for these small bait dealers, it's almost putting them out of business. So these invasive species have a direct impact, and it's here. Even though a lot of our lakes have not yet been impacted, I'm amazed that Gull Lake in the Brainerd area has not yet been impacted because of all the traffic coming from different lakes. But how does your group work with something if you find invasive species? What do you do with your in your partnership?
You know, it was a very interesting learning experience for me because when we started the program, we always said that we would not fund vegetation management. We wouldn't help you fund spraying. This is another of my favorite bad jokes. It was too much like a haircut grant. That I could give you a grant for a haircut and you'd look good for 30 days. But at the end of 30 days, you're hairy again and the money is gone. So many programs for managing vegetation are the same. And so in the early days of the program, I said, if you've got too many weeds, let's ask ourselves why. The odds are you've got a nutrient problem. And why treat the symptom without addressing the cause? I have to confess that invasive species have changed that equation. Nowadays, we will help you set up an invasive species management program, but you have to work with the DNR so that you can consider and try and minimize the adverse impacts. We don't want you to successfully manage invasive species but destroy the fishery in the bargain. And we also want you to go in there with your eyes open about the cost because it's very, very expensive. If you have curly leaf pondweed or Eurasian milfoil, even at a small lake, it could easily cost $20,000 or $30,000 in the first year.
Wow.
Yeah, and most groups would struggle to figure out how to sustainably fund that. There are very few DNR grants to help you, but DNR is hard-pressed for funds these days too, and is still trying to figure out what the ecologically sound way to manage invasive species are. So you're pretty much on your own. Probably the most effective way groups have done it within the central part of the state is creating what's called a lake improvement district, which basically means you tax yourself locally. And it's a way to equitably raise some fairly serious money. If you're effective in those first few years and knock down the invasive species, ideally you'll have a reduced budget by about the third year and can cut back. But it's kind of like chemo. A little bit of chemo doesn't do you any good. It just makes you sick. If you're going to do this, you actually have to go in and hit it pretty hard, and then hopefully also be on a nutrient reduction diet and trying to encourage native plants so that they'll fill that void that the invasive species have taken over right now.
You know, kind of the interesting player in this is the lakeshore owners, because they feel ownership of these lakes.
Yes.
But the lakes are owned by all of us, of course, not
That's
just
right.
by people who live on the lake. But sometimes I know there have been proposals by some lakeshore groups to minimize letting people come on their lakes through their public landings. It hasn't been a problem yet, but I could see where that could even start to develop to be into some kind of an issue.
You bet. No, and I am a lakeshore homeowner, and I think the day you heard your neighbor has invasive species, that's your first reaction. By gosh, we need to man the gate at the public landing. But it is a public landing, and any benefit you get from state management, whether it's fish stocking or assistance from pollution control, is offered because that's a public water of Minnesota, and it really is the asset of all of us. I think education at the public landing, a welcoming party. Ray, good to see you here at our lake. By the way, have you checked your prop before you come in? And we'll even help you check it on the way out too. All of that is very appropriate. In fact, the Whitefish Property Owners Association and the Pelican Lake Properties Association here in Crow Wing County have been very, very sophisticated in their prevention education programs, both of which we have helped fund.
And I know the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is putting a real push this summer
Yes.
on making sure that you know what the rules are when you come into a lake. If you come from an invasive lake that's been identified as an invasive area, you have to have all the water out of your boat when you leave that landing. And if you have a box of leeches, you even have to have the water off those leeches when you leave.
Yep.
So there's a lot of rules, and it's important for people, I think, to keep up with what they are. What are some of the major issues that you see damaging our rivers?
Rivers are a lot harder to manage than lakes, in part because on a lake, not unlike the story I told you about my own lake, if you have a lake home, you know that ultimately you're the master of your own fate. But on a river, if you're not happy with the state of the river, it's usually that jerk upstream or the poor sucker down. They don't have the same sense of community that lake homeowner associations do. Certainly there are invasive species entering rivers as well. The zebra mussel was found here in Brainerd on the Mississippi about the same time it was diagnosed at Osawatomie upriver. Another issue that has been litigated in recent years is whether wastewater treatment plants are adequately treating phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients. They are not completely removed by wastewater treatment, and boy, it could adversely impact our ability to grow.
Are there a lot of municipalities that still dump their waste or their treated water into the river?
Oh, very much. You'd rather dump it into a river than a lake, because dilution is the solution to pollution, but it doesn't mean it's completely treated. And again, phosphorus and nitrogen are hard to remove. And there have been cases, Maple Grove and, boy, I'm going to forget it, another community down toward the cities were both, went all the way to the Supreme Court as to whether they would be allowed to expand their wastewater treatment plants, because the argument was the river was impaired below their discharge point, and they couldn't add a single ounce of phosphorus unless that was addressed. And the suit, the settlement was complicated. In the end, the Pollution Control Agency was allowed to balance phosphorus watershed-wide. They would try and treat it more aggressively up or downstream and allow Maple Lake to expand. But it was a tough issue. And as population becomes more dense, it's not one that will go away.
Wow. So your organization, the partnership, works with lakeshore owners,
Yep.
Different groups of people who have interest in the water.
Yes.
And then you connect that to soil conservation districts, the Minnesota DNR. You're not reinventing the wheel. You're almost more of a organization bringing groups together to work together.
We are. I swear most of my job is matchmaking, and probably the best days, my favorite projects, are when I get uncommon partners working together. My all-time favorite story, if I have time, involves a lake on the border of Stearns and Todd County, Big Birch Lake. And they'd had a marvelous water quality sampling program and figured out that a third of all the nutrients entering the lake came through a single small tributary. Nutrients, of course, grow algae. You don't want them. the tributary was coming off of a single landowner's property, a corn farmer, row crops. And so the president, Gene Waldorf, went to talk to the farmer. And the farmer knew why he was coming, met him at the door and said, "Gene, if you're here to talk to me about those darn federal programs, I'm not interested. They don't pay enough and they're too restrictive. Go away." Gene said, "Cut it out. I'm your neighbor. Let me buy you coffee." Short version is that Gene asked, "How much did you make in corn production? 50 feet, 100 feet either side of that stream last year. If we guaranteed you 10% more every year, indexed the price of corn, would you work with us? You're going to pay me not to grow?" "Yeah." They shook hands. It's a neighborly agreement. They didn't even have a written contract, but within 3 years, within 2 years, water clarity, how deep you can see a disc, had improved by 3 feet.
Wow.
That's the best success story anywhere in the world that I've ever heard. What's even neater is who has credibility with the other farmers. It's not us pointy-headed Lake Association people. That farmer is telling his colleagues that they can trust these guys. They're not out to rake them over the coals. The third PS on this story is that Gene got a call from an attorney, which isn't always a good day, but this one said a widow had died and left the Lake Association $68,000. She said, "Not only are you good stewards of the lake, but you're frugal with money too, and I know you'll use this well."
Wow.
And so they've got an endowment now to be able to continue to fund all kinds of good works.
So the organization is the Initiative Foundation, and the project we're talking about tonight is Healthy Lakes and Rivers Partnership. And the Initiative Foundation does have a website. I'm sure you can go to that website and find out more information about this. Is there anything else you'd like to add in 10 seconds?
Oh, in 10 seconds. Yogi Berra says, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. We try and help people identify where they want to be and give them the tools to get there.
So it's a great organization, and you're doing, I think, really valuable work, because what is more important than clean water?
Amen.
Not much.
Spoken like a true Minnesotan.
You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we talk about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.